Hi guys, today I'm going to be looking at my stove and in particular the oven. I've had an issue where the oven doesn't seem to be getting as hot as usual. I believe I found the source of the problem, but in the process of diagnosing this problem, I've had to troubleshoot a few other components. So I'm just going to go through those step by step. And if you're having a similar issue, or even if it's another issue related to the oven, the steps that I'm taking to troubleshoot may help you find your own solution. So let's get started. Before we get started, let's have a look at what the issue is. So here I'm going to turn the stove on, bake. So now it's going to preheat to 350. If I open up the oven here and I put my hand in, I can feel it starting to get warmer, but if I touch the bottom element, it's not even getting hot. So there's definitely an issue there. Now, one thing I did notice through all of this is that the oven still gets warm, not as hot as it's supposed to be. Say it's 350 degrees it's set to. I'm getting a reading about 200 degrees. So some heat is still coming from the broil element. So for some reason, even when it's on bake, the broil element helps out just a little bit. So I've just been putting a little thermometer inside, just like this. And I've just been using broil to actually continue to use this oven to cook in the meantime. So that could be a workaround for you as well. One thing to note if you are using broil is that the temperature regulator doesn't seem to stop the heat. So it just keeps getting hotter and hotter and you'll end up burning your food. And I learned this the hard way. So what I've been doing is I just keep this little thermometer in there and I use the broil option until it gets high enough to a temperature that I'm looking for, and then I just turn it back on bake, and then the temperature slowly drops a little bit. I'll keep an eye on it and I'll hit broil again, sort of like a manual temperature regulator. And this worked for probably the last month or so, but today I'm going to attempt to fix it properly. The first thing you're going to want to do is measure the resistance of the elements to see if they're burnt or not. So you can do this one of two ways. You can actually take the element out of the oven, or as I'm going to do is you can just pull your stove out and remove the back panel and you can test the elements from the contacts on the other side. So to start that, first thing I'm going to do is pull the stove out and unplug it so that I'm working on it without any power. Okay, so now I'm just going to remove the back cover. Okay, with that panel off, we can now see all the wires that go to the different components. I'm just going to point out a few here. We've got a little transformer here, and that's to step the 240 volt down to 120 for the fluorescent light that's in there. Down here, we have the two wires for the lower oven element. And then we've got two wires here for the broil element. We've got a connector here for the temperature sensor, temperature probe. And then just down here are all the terminals for the 240 volt input power. So the first thing I'm going to do is test our elements, and that'll help you decide whether or not it's your element that's bad or if it's something else. So we're going to unplug the bottom elements here. Just give it a little wiggle, the two connectors should come off. Some models you may have to unscrew these. And then the broil element, so we can compare. They might have a different resistance because one might be bigger than the other, but they should be fairly close. So we're going to take our multimeter, we're going to throw it on very low range to start, so 200 ohms. And we're going to connect that, so I can put that in the spot where you can see. And we're just going to touch the two terminals. We're getting 26.5 ohms on the bottom one, and on the top about 22 ohms. So those are both in operating range, so I would say that both those elements are still good. So I'm just going to reconnect those wires. And it really doesn't matter which goes where. This is AC. So there's no positive or negative. So if those elements are working fine, then maybe we have an issue with our thermal sensor. So what we're going to do is test that. We're going to disconnect it. And we're going to set our multimeter back on ohms, but in the 2000 ohm range. And we're just going to probe behind here on the connector. And here we're getting just under 1200 ohms. Now there's a chart, if you look it up, for different models of oven thermal sensors, and the range usually goes a little over 1200 to I think 2000 or so, depending on the model. So that measurement we just got is in the range for a cold or room temperature thermal sensor. So we know that's working fine. So I'm just going to reconnect it. Okay, so we know that the hardware is working all right. So now we're just going to go up top and we're going to take a look at the circuit board. Okay, so now I just have to disassemble this top portion here. A lot of stoves are built differently, so I'm not going to go into great detail on how it comes apart. So I'm just going to go straight to it. Okay, so I've got enough apart now that I can access the circuit board. So I'm just going to pull on this little panel here. And I've had this apart before, so I've got a little more slack than you may. But you can just remove some of these little ties and reroute some of the wires so you have just a little more slack. So I have enough now that I can pull this all the way out so I can take it, disconnect it and work on it. So if you're going to take something like this apart, I suggest taking pictures of each of the plugs and wires so you make sure you plug them back in the right location. So I'm just going to unplug these guys. Okay, so I've got the board out. Okay, so now I've got our control board here. Now we really want to be careful with this because we just had this plugged in and these capacitors are going to be storing power for quite a while. There are ways to drain them, but I don't mess around with that. I'm just extra careful around them. So some of the things I'm going to be looking for is looking at the capacitors to see if any of them are swelled or leaking. Now we're looking at these. They all look really good, even the little ones. This guy looks good, and then two over here. So capacitors are looking good. Next, I'm going to be looking for any burnt spots, maybe blown resistors or diodes or something. Everything looks fine. I've got a little transformer here, and that's to go 220 volts down to 12 or 24, whatever the circuit board uses. And I'm not seeing anything wrong with the components on this side. So if there's an issue with the main control chip here, there's not much I can do with that. I'd probably have to replace the board. But I do notice that there's some relays here. And these are pretty standard looking relays. There's also this big guy here. And when I looked at the wiring on this, I don't have a wiring diagram, but I did notice that line 2 connects here and the other terminal goes to both the broiler and the bake element. So I know that this relay has something to do with the bake cycle. And I noticed that the other end of the element is here and here on these two relays. So I know that one of these is for the broil and one of these is for the bake. So I'm going to take a look at these three relays to make sure they're working properly. Now this relay doesn't have a cover on it, so it's pretty easy for me to probe that coil. So I'm just going to take my multimeter again, and normally I test relays in the 200 ohm range, but I tested this one earlier and it seems that it's a lot higher, so I'm going to go 2000 ohms, and we're going to test this guy. So we can see about 640 ohms, so that coil seems to be fine. And if we look at the switch, it's still open. Now these with the covers on them, I'm going to have to go on the bottom of the board. Now again, I have to be careful where I touch because we're on the exposed side of those capacitors. Okay, let's have a look at those relays. So those relays are just on the other side of this circuit board. I can see there's 6 little tabs on each. So I've got one going one way and I've got 6 here. So the smaller wire is the coil side, which apparently is 9 volts on this according to the top of the relay. So we can see we've got 211 ohms on that one. If we check this one, about the same, 210 ohms. Now it looks like there's 2 separate switches on each of the relays. If I check those, they're open, 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 open. Now if I was braver, I would power this and test it closed, but I'm not going to go there. So far it looks all right with the coil working. And then we've got the one from the other side that we tested. If we look here on the coil side, 640 ohms, and the switch side is open. So those relays appear to be all right. So while we're here, I'm just going to look at some of the solder to make sure that there's nothing that's corroded or has vibrated loose or broken. So I can see that that solder appears to be broken, and it's more than likely making contact, but there's a chance that it may lose contact. So I may fix that one up. I'm just going to go through the rest here. Okay, so I see a little bit more here. It's difficult to see, but looks like these terminals here, the solder has broken loose a little bit on, looks like 5 of these. Now they seem to still be making contact. Spin that around. If I touch post and the solder, so it is still making contact, but again, it's possible that once it gets warm and things expand, that it may not be working as well. So I may just touch up the solder on that, but I'm really not seeing a whole lot wrong with this. Okay, so let's touch up some of that solder. Okay, with that touched up, we're just going to put everything back together. I think it's worth mentioning also this relay that I pointed out. This is the L2 relay. It's a very common problem for the welds to break on this. On my particular board, the welds are fine, and this is the reason I was making the video. I expected these to be bad on my board, but they're okay. But if you are having issues with the bake element, have a look at this relay. It's only about a $5 or $6 relay, and I've seen in many forums that people have replaced these or just repaired the solder on them, and that's fixed their issue. I thought that was going to be my problem, but it appears I had some other broken solders. Right, so I've got everything back together, so I'm going to plug it in and we'll see if it works. Okay, so the moment of truth. Put on bake 350. Start it up. Get my thermometer. That's going to go inside. So it does feel like it's getting warm. Give it a minute, see if it turns red. Feel both elements getting warm. We'll see if it's warm enough. So I can see the element just starting to turn a dark red. That's a good sign. So definitely turning red. That's a good sign. All right, so I'm going to close the oven and we're going to see if it gets up to temperature. Okay, so I've given it a few minutes to get up to temperature. If we take a look inside, we see 350 on the thermometer. And if I use my infrared, we have about 325, 330. So pretty close to 350. So it appears to be working. I can see now it's just turned on again since I have the door open. So I'm not able to say exactly what my problem was. I did find those broken solders. In the past, taking things apart, putting them back together sometimes solves the problem just by having loose connections that are connected properly. But I think this was a good exercise as we got to look at how to test our two elements and how to test the thermal sensor and just looking at the circuit board for anything that is really obvious that needs repair. Having the wiring diagram is very beneficial. I don't have that for this particular stove, so I've had to figure out myself just by following the wires and looking at wiring diagrams for similar stoves. But for now, everything seems to be working properly, so I'm going to end this video. If you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do, and I'll see you in the next one.